The Intentional Torts to Persons project, I think, was only undertaken fairly recently because initially when the American Law Institute decided to address some torts topics, it thought it was only going to intervene in a few really critical areas. So products liability, I believe, was the first, apportionment of liability, dealing with issues such as joint and several liability was another early one. And then it became clear that the approach of a restatement third of torts in the late 20th century and early 21st century is going to be very different from the approach that was taken in the restatement first and second. There's much more of an understanding today that the underlying principles and policies behind the doctrines are quite critical to understanding what their scope is and what it should be. So given this new style and this new approach, it was decided to go beyond a few selected topics in the restatement of torts and cover basically all of the important areas of tort. And one of those important areas is intentional torts to persons, which is the name of this project. And that essentially covers the torts of battery, assault, and what's traditionally known as false imprisonment.
One of the challenges we had in drafting this is that up till now, courts have not done a fantastic job of defining what they mean by an assertion of legal authority. However, it is clear that courts are applying it in cases beyond that simply of police officers. We have cases where there's a flight attendant, where there's a school teacher, where there's a principal, where security guards. So clearly this has been applied by courts more broadly than simply police. In fact, it could be extraordinarily broad because in most states there are citizen arrest provisions. Coming up are some very interesting provisions on consent, and the consent issues are really fascinating, really interesting, and will be controversial in some ways. For example, just as the Model Penal Code project has had to deal with consent to sexual battery, we have to deal with it in the civil context. And I suspect that it may not come out quite exactly the way they did it in the criminal context, and I think there are good reasons for that. But they're really fascinating and important for contemporary issues in the news to deal with these.